before tales of Bigfoot echoed through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, another figure haunted the edge of civilization. Hair-covered, silent, sometimes savage, he lived in the woods beyond the plough line, beyond the monastery walls. In medieval Europe they called him the wodewose, the wild man, and though we've buried him in myths and margins, his footprints still show up in stone, in ink, and maybe even in memory. So as you get cozy, let your mind drift through time. Don't worry about staying awake, just follow the story wherever it takes you. And if you enjoy falling asleep to history, consider subscribing so you'll always have a story waiting for you at night. We begin in a quiet European village, sometime in the late Middle Ages. The cottages rest close together, their thatched roofs leaning like tired shoulders. Beyond the last garden plots, the fields give way to the tree line. The forest stands dark, tall, and unbroken, like a great wall of green silence. A child pauses at the edge, watching the trees sway in the evening breeze. His small hand clutches a bundle of firewood. He hesitates before stepping back toward the safety of the hearth, for the forest holds stories, and the villagers whisper them often. They say there is someone who walks within, not a beast, not a man, but something between, a figure covered in hair, carrying a heavy club. He appears in carvings on church walls, in songs at the tavern, and in fears told softly before sleep. The people call him the wodewose, the wild man. Travellers carry the same tale from valley to valley. A merchant trudging down a forest road glances at the undergrowth where a shadow seems too tall, too still. A monk alone at dawn writes in the margin of his book about footprints too large to be human. The image is always the same, the wilderness itself stepping forward, reminding humankind of its frailty. The wild man, in these early stories, is not always cruel. Sometimes he is a protector of the forest, sometimes a thief who drags sheep into the thickets, and sometimes he is little more than a distant rumour, a way for the villagers to explain the strange cries that echo at night. Imagine the thoughts of a woodcutter standing beneath the tall oaks. He grips his axe, sweat on his brow. He wonders if today he will catch sight of the figure his father once described. His mind drifts between caution and curiosity. What would it mean to see the wild man with his own eyes? Would it bring blessing or misfortune? These questions hang in the air like smoke from the hearth. They pass from one generation to the next, carried as lightly as lullabies. And so the wild man becomes more than a tale. He becomes a mirror of the human mind in uncertain times. As night deepens, the villagers close their doors, but the thought remains. Out there, beyond the reach of firelight, someone might still be walking. Someone older than kings, older than castles, waiting in the shadows of Europe's endless woods. And with this, the myth of the medieval wild man settles into history, patient, enduring, and ready to guide us further into the dark forests of the past. The stories of the wild man did not remain only in whispers among villagers. They travelled, carried by merchants along river roads, and by pilgrims making their way to shrines. In each retelling, small details shifted. Sometimes he was taller, sometimes smaller, sometimes clothed in moss or bark, sometimes covered entirely in hair. Yet the essence stayed the same, a figure who belonged more to the forest than to the hearth. By firelight, children listened wide-eyed as their elders spoke of him. The words were slow, deliberate, like embers glowing in the dark. The listeners leaned closer, half afraid and half enchanted. For in every tale the wild man reminded them of a truth they already sensed, that the boundary between human life and wilderness was thinner than it seemed. At monasteries, too, his presence was felt, though differently. Monks walked through cloisters with measured steps, praying against temptation and chaos. And yet, just beyond their walls, the forest rose in silence, and the stories of the wild man found their way even into holy places. Some scribes, while copying sacred texts, allowed a small image of him to creep into the margins, as if unable to resist acknowledging the figure that haunted both field and imagination. Thus, from villages to cloisters, from hearth to scriptorium, the wild man stood quietly at the edge of medieval life. Not always seen, not always feared, but always remembered. His story became part of the landscape, as enduring as the oak and as secretive as the wolf. And so, when winter nights grew long, and the wind pressed against the shutters, people thought again of the wodewose, not just as a creature of fable, but as someone who might at any moment be watching from the edge of the trees. The wild man of medieval Europe was never only a tale. He was a presence carried in voices, carved in stone, and passed from hearth to hearth. For some he was a warning, for others a mystery that gave shape to the silence of the woods. As villagers closed their shutters and monks lit their evening candles, the thought remained that just beyond the boundary of field and wall, someone still walked, older than kings, and older than stone. The chapter of first whispers and early memory rests here, like twilight settling over a quiet village. Beyond the last plough line, the forest waits, and within it, the stories of monks, woodcutters, and travellers who claim to glimpse the wild man's path. The path narrows as it enters the forest, soft earth pressed by the passing of carts and hooves. Beyond, the trees close in, branches leaning overhead, until the road feels like a tunnel of bark and leaf. In these places every sound lingers, the call of a bird, the snap of a twig, the sigh of wind that feels almost like a breath. Monasteries often rose at the edge of such woods, stone walls and cloisters pressed against the wild, as though holy order might stand firm against ancient chaos. Within those walls, monks walked slowly along covered walkways, beads in hand, voices low in prayer. Yet even here, stories of the wild man seeped inside. In one dim scriptorium, a monk bends over parchment. His quill moves carefully, the candle flickering near his elbow. The letters form in neat lines, Latin prayers flowing across the page. Then, in the margin, the ink shifts. He draws a small figure, a shaggy man with a club. Why? Perhaps he recalls a story told by travellers, or perhaps he himself saw footprints pressed into new snow one winter morning. He leaves no explanation, only the image preserved for centuries. Woodcutters, too, carried such memories. When the day's labour ended, they returned to the village with bundles of logs and quiet voices. Around their fire they spoke of something that watched them while they worked, a rustling that did not sound like deer, a stillness too heavy to be wind. One man, old and weathered, pressed his palms together and said softly, "It waits, always at the edge." His companions shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking toward the dark window. The forests of medieval Europe were not empty spaces. They were boundaries between land owned and land untamed, between the known and the unknowable. To cross them was to risk losing oneself. Travellers left markers, a bent branch, a carved symbol on bark, a pile of stones to remind them of the way. And yet there were always paths that seemed unfamiliar on the return journey, as if the forest itself had moved. For villagers, the wild man gave form to this uncertainty. He was the one who left the tracks too wide for a human foot. He was the figure glimpsed between beeches at dusk, taller than a man, silent as moss. He explained the missing sheep, the vanished hunter, the echo of a voice no one could place. And in this way the wodewose became both warning and memory. He reminded the people to respect the woodlands, to walk carefully, to return before nightfall. His story was less about terror and more about humility. Humans were small, fragile, and temporary, beside the great patience of the forest. In the hush of twilight, bells from the monastery carried out into the trees. Their chime faded into the distance, but perhaps just beyond hearing, another sound followed, a heavy step pressed softly into damp earth, moving back toward the cover of leaves. The monastery bells grew faint as the evening deepened, swallowed by the forest's hush. Along the dirt path leading back to the village, a lone traveller paused. He shifted the strap of his satchel, the weight of parchment and small goods pressing against his shoulder. He glanced behind him, uneasy. The road was empty, yet his thoughts crowded in. Was that a footstep, or only his own echo? The forest had a way of repeating sounds, of disguising them until they felt unfamiliar. He tightened his cloak and pressed on, telling himself it was nothing more than deer moving in the underbrush. Still, the old stories nudged at his memory. In many monasteries, these tales were written down not as fables but as cautionary lessons. Marginal notes, sermons, and quiet accounts spoke of beings who blurred the line between human and beast. Some monks described them as souls not yet redeemed, wandering in nature's rawness. Others saw them as metaphors for humankind without the guiding light of faith, a reminder of what men might become if they abandoned the path of virtue. But among villagers, the meaning was simpler. The wild man was not a symbol. He was someone who could be seen, if only briefly. He was a presence that explained the unknown. His existence made sense of the silence that sometimes pressed too heavily, or the sudden disappearance of a flock left unattended. One winter, a story was whispered of a shepherd who followed strange tracks across a frozen meadow. The prints were deeper than his own, wider than any man's foot, and led straight toward the thickets. When he followed them, he felt a sudden stillness, as though the forest itself held its breath. He returned home without seeing a figure, but he told his neighbors he had felt eyes watching from between the pines. His words lingered in their minds longer than the snow remained on the ground. Evenings often carried such memories. A group of woodcutters, resting after the day's labor, sat around a fire near the village gate. Their hands warmed by the flames, their voices low, they shared their own recollections. One man leaned closer, the firelight catching the lines of his face. "It never comes close," he murmured, "but it never leaves either." His companions nodded, each imagining the forest edge in their own way, a shadow, a watcher, a figure who chose silence over words. And in that moment, the wild man was not just a story, but a shared understanding, woven into the very rhythm of their lives. The chapter of whispered tracks and forest-edge glances gently closes here, with the sound of a night breeze moving softly through the pines as though carrying the echo of unseen footsteps deeper into the woods. In the cool stillness of a medieval church, light filters through narrow windows, falling in slender beams across the stone floor. The air smells faintly of wax and incense. Along the carved columns, small figures emerge, saints, angels, and creatures less certain. Among them sometimes stands the wild man. He is etched in stone, his body covered in rough lines of hair, a heavy club in hand. His stance is strong, almost defiant, yet his face is often carved with something gentler. Wide eyes, lips neither smiling nor scowling, as though caught between two worlds. Parishioners may have glanced at him while entering for Mass, recognizing in his form the shadow of stories told by their grandparents. In Manuscripts too he appeared. The scribe, bent low over vellum, left more than words. In the margins he drew small figures to accompany the text. There, hidden beside the flowing Latin script, walks the wodewose, sometimes chasing a knight, sometimes cradling a club, sometimes simply standing among vines. The drawings are tiny, no larger than a thumb, but they carry a presence that feels larger, as if the forest itself has slipped onto the page. Tapestries brought him into homes and halls. Woven threads told of hunts, of gardens, of battles. Among the animals and noble figures, the wild man appears again. His hair is stitched in muted browns, his club in darker hues, his place always at the border between order and wilderness. Those who dined beneath these tapestries could not escape his silent watch. Imagine a young noblewoman pausing before such a cloth. Her fingers trail lightly over the fabric. She wonders what it means. Is the wild man a danger, a lesson, or perhaps a memory of something long past? She does not say her thoughts aloud, but they rest within her. Quiet as the forest outside her father's castle walls. Artists did not invent him. They echoed what people already carried in their minds. Every carving, every thread, every inked line added to the memory of a figure who belonged both to the imagination and to the landscape itself. The presence of the wild man in art was a reminder. He was not distant, not forgotten. He lived in the symbols of faith, in the warnings of stories, and in the decorations of daily life. He was part of Europe's shared dream, stitched as carefully into the culture as into the tapestries that still hang today. As the candlelight flickers across a stone carving in the church, the shadow of the wild man stretches softly across the wall, as if reminding the onlookers that he has always been near, waiting in the silence between prayer and forest. The carvings and tapestries were more than decoration. They were memory made visible. In an age when most people could not read, stone and thread spoke their own language. They told stories, warned, and preserved what words alone could not carry. In the cloisters, monks sometimes debated the meaning of such images. One might trace the outline of a hairy figure in a manuscript and murmur, "He is man without grace, the untamed soul." Another, less certain, might reply, "Or perhaps he is what we fear, living beside us, never fully gone." Their quiet voices echoed under vaulted ceilings, carried like faint prayers. The people in villages did not debate so finely. For them, the wild man carved above a church doorway was not only symbol but presence. As mothers passed beneath with their children, they may have pointed gently, whispering, "Behave, or he will come from the woods." The figure served as warning, a silent guardian reminding all to tread carefully. At festivals, however, the image grew playful. Masks of fur and coarse cloth appeared, men wrapped in branches dancing through the streets. The wild man became laughter and music, his story reshaped for celebration. Yet even as the crowd cheered, a part of the figure's mystery remained untouched. Behind the costumes there was always the question, was this only imitation, or a reflection of something real hidden still in the forest? One tapestry, preserved through centuries, shows the wild man not as threat, but as companion. He walks beside a noblewoman, offering a branch of fruit. His posture is humble, almost protective. The weaver's choice is curious, perhaps hinting at an older tale, where the boundary between human and wild was less sharp, where friendship might spring from the meeting of forest and village. These varied images remind us that the wild man was never fixed. He could be danger, warning, or wonder. He could be a shadow in the trees or a figure stitched in gold thread. He was as changeable as the forest itself, sometimes dark, sometimes generous, always just beyond complete understanding. As night falls in the church, the last candle sputters and fades. The carvings along the wall blur into shadow, their details hidden. Yet if one lingers, it is easy to imagine that the wild man steps down from stone, moving silently toward the door, back into the forest where his story began. The year turns harsh, frost lingers longer on the ground, and the stores in the village barns grow thin. Families measure their grain carefully, stretching each handful further than the last. Children watch the sky for signs of spring, their faces pale in the weak winter light. In such seasons, stories of the wild man return with greater weight. The forest, so near and yet so untamed, becomes both hope and threat. It offers firewood, berries, and game, but it also hides dangers unseen. When a hunter does not return, whispers pass quickly. Perhaps he wandered too deep. Perhaps he met the wild man. The absence of proof is filled with fear, and the figure of the wodewose steps once more into the villager's thoughts. At the edge of one settlement, a farmer tends his field with care. Though the soil yields little, he straightens his back and stares at the woods beyond. What if there is food hidden there? Mushrooms, roots, or creatures that could be trapped? Yet he hesitates, recalling stories of footprints found beside sheep pens, of shapes that move too swiftly among the trees. His hunger presses him forward, but his caution keeps him rooted to the path. Medieval chronicles sometimes tell of winters so bitter that wolves came into the villages. The wild man too was imagined crossing those same thresholds. Unlike wolves, he was not merely beast, he was something closer, unsettling because he was both like and unlike the humans who feared him, a mirror showing what people might become if stripped of shelter and faith. During famines, villagers often spoke of figures wandering the forests, driven by hunger, ragged and half-mad. Were these outcasts mistaken for wild men, or did such sightings confirm the old stories? In either case, the image was fixed. The boundary between human survival and the wodewose was perilously thin. Inside monasteries, prayers rose louder in these times. Candles flickered in long vigils, monks asking for deliverance from hunger and fear, and still the forest pressed close against their walls, filled with the same uncertainty. To many, the wild man symbolized this constant struggle, the reminder that order and safety were fragile, always at risk of being reclaimed by the wilderness. Yet even in these fears, there was a quiet lesson. The wild man was not simply enemy. He was a sign of the forest's endurance, its refusal to be conquered. When fields failed and granaries emptied, the woods remained vast and alive, indifferent to human suffering but never entirely closed to human need. As the seasons softened, as buds returned to branches and streams ran free of ice, the villagers breathed easier. The memory of hunger retreated, but the wild man stayed in thought. He was the shape they gave their dread, the figure who stood silently at the frontier between despair and survival. And so each harsh season renewed his presence, carving him deeper into memory, like frost etching its patterns on the window of a hut. The thawing of spring did not erase the fears of winter. It only softened them. In the muddy lanes of the village, people spoke of what they had endured and what they had seen. A shepherd's wife recalled hearing heavy steps outside her cottage one night, though no prints were found the next morning. A group of children insisted they had glimpsed a tall figure moving between the birches, its shape fading into mist. Such stories were not dismissed outright. Instead, they folded naturally into the rhythm of survival. The wild man became a way of explaining why hardships came, and why they eventually passed. He was both scapegoat and symbol, part of the living fabric of fear and hope that defined medieval life. In some accounts, the wodewose appeared not only as a thief of food, but as a keeper of it. Travellers in the highlands spoke of caches of nuts, berries and roots hidden in caves, as though someone or something had gathered them with care. Were these the stashes of hermits or the imagined larders of the wild man himself? The answer did not matter. What mattered was that the forest seemed alive with intention, guided by a figure who was never fully seen. Hunger sharpened imagination. At the forest edge, a farmer paused during his work, staring at the shifting shadows beneath the trees, his hands, rough from soil, clenched around his hoe. If the wild man holds food, why should he keep it? He wondered silently. But he did not step forward. To cross that line would mean more than trespassing into the woods. It would mean entering the world of the wild man, a world few returned from. Chroniclers, writing in the safety of stone halls, sometimes described these beliefs with quiet sympathy. They knew how thin the margin was between survival and ruin. The wild man became a reminder that human life could tip into wildness if hunger grew too deep. He was, in this way, both legend and truth. When the first green shoots pushed through thawing soil, the villagers felt relief ripple through their days. Yet in the hush of night, as they lay down on straw mats and listened to the forest hum with new life, the thought returned: the wild man had watched them endure. He had stood at the border between famine and plenty, silent witness to both. Thus his legend deepened with each passing season, shaped not only by fear of the unknown, but by the very rhythm of nature itself, harsh, patient, and eternal. The chapter closes softly here, with the sound of spring water trickling through melted snow, carrying with it the memory of hunger, and the quiet figure who lingered always at the forest frontier. In the courts of Europe, where banners hung heavy with colour and halls echoed with music, the wild man was not forgotten. Here, among nobles dressed in silk and velvet, his image appeared again, this time woven into pageantry, performance and ritual. Great hunts were central to the life of kings. They rode into the forests with horns sounding, hounds barking, and spears gleaming in the sun. Yet even in this world of order and command, the wild man intruded. Chroniclers describe hunts where a figure, hairy and unkempt, stepped into the path of riders. Was it a hermit, a fugitive, or something older? Something the villagers already knew by name. The huntsman rarely chased him. To see him was enough, a reminder that the forest still held its own sovereign. In castles, festivals brought the wild man indoors. Masquerades were staged where courtiers donned heavy costumes of fur, their faces darkened with soot, their hands clutching wooden clubs. They danced, growled, and played the part of the wodewose, while nobles and ladies laughed and applauded. Yet beneath the laughter was an unease. The mask resembled too closely the stories whispered beyond the walls. One famous pageant tells of dancers dressed as wild men, torches flickering in their hands. The flames caught too near their costumes, and fire spread suddenly, leaping from fur to fur. Panic filled the hall as onlookers rushed forward, beating at the flames with cloaks. The performers survived only by chance, their wild masks transformed from jest to near tragedy. For those who witnessed it, the line between entertainment and omen felt frighteningly thin. But not all portrayals were fearful. In some festivals, the wild man was a playful spirit, chasing villagers through the streets, scattering children who squealed with delight. He was part of the turning of the year, a reminder of the wilderness tamed through laughter and dance. These performances blurred the boundary between dread and celebration, showing how deeply the wild man lived in both imagination and ritual. Imagine the thoughts of a young boy standing in a castle courtyard during such a festival. He watches the dancers covered in fur, their movements heavy yet wild. He wonders quietly if the real figure in the forest moves in the same way. For him, the mask is not only performance, it is possibility. Thus, in the courts of kings and in the squares of villages alike, the wild man became both spectacle and warning. He lived in the balance between order and chaos, the forest and the fire, the mask and the mystery. And when the music faded and the torches burned low, his presence lingered still in memory, in laughter and in the faint shiver that comes when one recalls that perhaps, somewhere beyond the festival lights, he was watching too. The festivals carried a rhythm that blended reverence with mischief. Masks of bark and moss, stitched together with straw and hide, transformed ordinary villagers into figures of the forest. By torchlight they ran through the narrow lanes, their shadows stretching long across the stone walls. Children darted between them, shrieking in mock fear, while elders watched with faint smiles, remembering the winters when such shadows carried more weight. In these celebrations the wild man was tamed, not defeated, but brought into the circle of human ritual. He became a character in stories sung aloud, a presence woven into games and dances. Yet the power of the mask was never dismissed entirely. For many, slipping on the costume was a serious act, as though one borrowed not only the shape but the spirit of the wodewose. At royal courts, the symbolism reached further. When kings and nobles appeared alongside dancers dressed as wild men, the message was subtle but clear. Civilization could embrace the wilderness, control it, and make it serve the spectacle of power. Yet even in these controlled spaces, accidents and unexpected moments reminded all that the wild man was not so easily confined. Travelers who moved from one region to another noticed how similar the masks appeared, though the details varied. In the alpine valleys, costumes were heavier with thick hides and twisted horns, while in coastal villages the wild man might carry seaweed and driftwood. Each place shaped him anew, yet his essence remained constant, a figure half human, half forest, lingering between fear and familiarity. Imagine a quiet evening after such a festival. The torches have burned down, the masks lie in a heap, and the laughter has faded into sleep. A villager passes the square and pauses. In the shadows, the discarded costumes seem almost to stir, as though the forest itself leans closer, curious at being imitated. The villager walks on, but the thought remains, perhaps the wild man does not need a mask at all. Thus, kings and peasants alike carried his memory forward. Whether as symbol of untamed danger, playful spirit of celebration, or solemn reminder of the forest's power, the wild man never fully left the stage. His presence, once called forth by fire and song, always returned to the silence of the trees, waiting, patient, unchanged. The chapter closes gently here with the echo of distant festival drums fading into the night, leaving only the quiet rustle of leaves beyond the village walls. Far from the laughter of festivals and the hunts of kings, another tradition grew in the shadows of the medieval forest. It was the life of saints and hermits, men and women who withdrew from towns and castles, seeking silence, prayer, and closeness to God. For them, the wilderness was not simply a place of fear, but a place of testing, purification, and quiet revelation. A pilgrim walking through the woods might stumble upon a crude shelter built from branches and moss. Inside, a hermit knelt on the earthen floor, lips moving in prayer. His clothes were ragged, his beard long, his skin weathered by wind and rain. To passing villagers, such a figure could easily be mistaken for the wild man himself. The difference was not always clear. Both lived outside society, both bore the marks of solitude, both walked paths untrodden by most. Medieval texts sometimes blurred the two even further. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, often described holy men in ways that echoed the wodewose. A saint might live in the woods for years, surviving only on roots and water, clothed in hair or in rags, barely distinguishable from the creatures around him. His sanctity was proven by this withdrawal, by becoming wild in the eyes of the world. Yet where one saw holiness, another might see only strangeness, a wild man rather than a saint. Monks reflected on this mystery. In their writings, the wilderness was both danger and sanctuary. The wild man represented the soul without faith, but the hermit represented the soul purified by it. Between these two figures stretched only a thin line, as delicate as the silence of dawn. Imagine a weary traveller resting at a forest spring. He sees a figure approaching slowly, barefoot, hair tangled, carrying a wooden staff. The man does not speak but kneels by the water, cupping it into his hands. For a moment the traveller wonders, is this a hermit blessed by God, or the wild man himself, come out of legend? The figure vanishes into the trees, leaving only the sound of water flowing. The traveller never knows the answer. In churches, sermons sometimes used the wild man as contrast to the saint. One was untamed and dangerous, the other purified and holy. Yet both shared the same silence of the woods, the same solitude beneath the trees. The difference lay not in appearance but in meaning. This closeness of saint and wild man reveals much about the medieval mind. The forest was not merely a backdrop, it was a living space where the human soul could lose itself or find itself anew. It held danger, but also salvation, and the figures who walked within, whether hermit or wodewose, carried lessons that reached far beyond the trees. As evening gathers around the cloisters, the bells call the monks to prayer. Yet somewhere deeper in the forest, another voice rises softly, not Latin chant, but the unspoken language of wind through branches. In that sound, one might hear the echo of both saint and wild man, two paths in the same wilderness. The medieval forest was never silent. It moved with the rustle of deer, the howl of wolves, and the deep growl of bears. Each sound carried its own weight, its own place in the imagination of those who lived near the trees. Yet in the uncertain moments between shadow and sight, animals and legend often blurred together. A shepherd driving his flock home at dusk might glimpse a large dark shape crossing the path. Too quick for certainty, too large for comfort. Was it a wandering bear, or the wild man himself, striding silently toward the hills? With no clear answer, the story tilted toward mystery, and the figure of the wodes gained another whispered tale. Wolves, in particular, held a special place in medieval fear. Their tracks often led villagers to believe something larger had passed. When livestock disappeared, the wolf was blamed first, but when the signs seemed too strange, too deliberate, the blame shifted toward the wild man. His presence explained what the eye could not fully confirm. Werewolves, too, shared in this shadowed company. In folk tales, men who roamed the woods at night, cursed or transformed, were said to wear the skin of the wolf. Some listeners drew little distinction between these stories and the accounts of the wild man. Both were figures of the in-between, neither holy beast nor holy man. Both carried the danger of the unknown and the fascination of transformation. Chroniclers wrote of travellers who mistook hermits for beasts, their bodies covered in rough hair after years of solitude, their eyes bright in the gloom. Hunters returned with tales of creatures glimpsed only at a distance, their shapes uncertain through the trees. Each misstep of vision, each fragment of sound, added to the long memory of the wodewose. Imagine a knight on patrol along a forest road. His horse shifts uneasily, ears flicking at noises in the undergrowth. The knight lowers his lance and peers into the trees. For a moment he sees a figure crouched low, taller than any man, its form shaggy and indistinct. He urges his horse forward, but the figure melts into the shadows. He returns to his men with more questions than answers, and his account joins the growing web of stories. The wild man, the werewolf, the bear, all became part of the same tapestry, threads woven by fear, memory, and imagination. Each blurred boundary kept the forest alive with meaning. The people did not need certainty. They needed only the reminder that beyond their fields and walls, the world remained vast, unpredictable, and never entirely human. As night falls, the sound of a distant howl carries across the fields. Villagers pause in their tasks, listening. Some say it is a wolf, others exchange glances and whisper the older name, the wild man. Both explanations fit, and neither can be proven. The wild man was never bound to one place. His shape shifted with the land, his stories echoing from mountain passes to windswept coasts. Each region of medieval Europe gave him its own colour, its own voice, its own quiet meaning. In the alpine valleys where villages clung to steep slopes and avalanches thundered in spring, the wodewose was often a guardian of high pastures. Shepherds told of figures who lingered among the rocks, shaggy and broad, watching over flocks from a distance. Some said he stole goats or scattered sheep, but others whispered he was merely curious, a solitary neighbour in the wilderness of stone and snow. Further north, in the misty forests of Germany, he appeared in carvings on town halls and church doors. Here he was more threatening, a reminder of chaos pressing always at the boundary of order. Travellers spoke of his voice, not words, but deep cries that carried through the trees, louder than any beast yet strangely human. Crossing westward into France and the Low Countries, his figure softened. There the wild man often appeared in stories of courtly love, offering fruit or flowers to noble women, a strange companion to knights and ladies. He became less a menace and more a symbol of untamed passion, his wilderness woven into the tapestry of romance. On the British Isles, his name shifted. He was the wodewose, a shadow in the oak groves, a hairy figure who guarded ancient springs or appeared at the edge of hunting grounds. Some linked him with the Green Man carved in churches, both figures embodying the restless spirit of nature, never fully subdued. In folk tales he was sometimes trickster, sometimes protector, always part of the land itself. The Iberian Peninsula shaped him differently still. In the rugged mountains of Spain, stories spoke of solitary wanderers, hairy and strong, living in caves. Villagers said they were men turned wild by exile or curse, yet in their strength lingered the echo of the older wodewose. They were reminders that the wilderness did not end where the fields began, but lived on in human form. Imagine a traveller moving across these lands, hearing the same figure described again and again, yet always a little different. In one village the wild man is feared as thief, in another he is remembered as a protector. On one coast he is a shadow of longing, on another a shadow of dread. The traveller might wonder, are these many beings, or one presence carried by memory across mountains and rivers? What unites them all is their place at the threshold. Wherever the forest begins, wherever the mountains rise, wherever the sea cliffs break against the wind, there too stands the wild man. Not fully seen, not fully gone, always present at the border between the human world and the great beyond. And so from alpine valleys to Atlantic shores the wodewose walked silently, wearing many names but carrying the same enduring shape. The wilderness made human, the untamed given form. Centuries passed, and ships began to sail westward, their sails swelling with the wind as Europe reached beyond its own shores. Along with goods, faith and language, travellers carried stories. Some were told openly in taverns, others quietly by firelight. Among them lingered the memory of the wild man. When Europeans first heard tales from the peoples of North America, they were struck by a strange familiarity. Native nations spoke of towering, hair-covered beings who lived in the forests and mountains, beings who avoided villages yet left signs of their presence. To European ears, these stories sounded like echoes of their own, the wodewose retold in a new land. But the resemblance was not exact. For native peoples, the figure held meanings far deeper than fear. Some nations described such beings as guardians of the land, watchers of the wilderness, spirits older than humankind. Others spoke of them as warnings, teachers, or distant neighbours. The European wild man was often a shadow of hunger and uncertainty. The North American counterpart was more complex, rooted in relationships with the natural world. Still, the parallels were too striking to ignore. A merchant listening in a coastal settlement may have whispered to his companions, "They too have a wild man, though by another name," and the thought settled in his mind that the forest itself, no matter where it stood, always produced a figure to walk within it. As stories crossed oceans, they began to mingle. In the dim light of a colonial tavern, someone might recall carvings from a church in France, while another repeated what a guide had said about the tall figures in the American woods. A new shape began to emerge, not wholly European, not wholly native, but a shadow stitched together by distance and imagination. Imagine a traveller by the campfire, staring into the dark line of trees. He remembers the wild man carved above a chapel door in his homeland, and he recalls too the tales just told to him by his native companions. Two stories, separated by oceans, now overlap in his thoughts. His eyes linger on the forest, waiting, half believing he might see the same figure his ancestors once whispered about in Europe's valleys. These crossings did not erase the old wild man of Europe, nor did they define the figures of North America, but together they wove a larger pattern. Wherever humans entered deep woods, they carried with them the sense that they were not alone. The wild man was not bound by culture or continent. He was a presence shaped by the forest itself. And so, in this mingling of old and new, the wodewose found fresh life. His memory stretched beyond Europe's shores into the vast wilderness of another world, where his footsteps echoed faintly in the stories of a new land. The centuries turn, and yet the wild man does not vanish. His shadow lingers in carvings that still gaze down from church walls, in manuscripts kept safe behind glass, in faded tapestries hanging in quiet halls. More than this, he survives in the imagination, an old presence walking silently beside humankind. For medieval villagers, he was a way to explain the strange sounds in the night, the missing sheep, the unease that came with entering the woods. For nobles, he was a mask at festivals, a symbol of chaos subdued for an evening's entertainment. For monks, he was a figure in margins, a lesson in the difference between wilderness and sanctity. And for us, centuries later, he is something else again. He is a reminder of how people once listened to the land, how every track in the snow, every broken branch, every distant cry carried meaning. In the Wildman, they gave form to their fears, but also to their respect for the forest. He was not merely a monster, he was the wilderness itself, alive, patient, untamed. Imagine walking today along a woodland path in Europe. The fields end, the trees rise tall, and the light falls in shifting patterns across moss and stone. The world is quieter here, and it feels suddenly older. Perhaps you pause, listening to the breeze as it stirs the branches. For a moment you might understand why those before us spoke of someone watching. Not an enemy, not a friend, but a neighbour whose presence was never entirely absent. The wild man lives on not because he was proven real, but because he was needed. He filled the space between human and forest, between order and wildness, between what can be known and what will always remain beyond reach. He still fills that space today, in the stories we tell, in the mysteries we cherish, in the quiet awe that comes when we step beneath the trees. As this journey closes, the last footprints fade into the undergrowth. The forest remains, vast and enduring, its silence alive with possibility. Somewhere within it, in the patient hush of leaves, the wild man walks still, not lost, not gone, but waiting, as he always has, at the edge of human memory.